Table-valued functions, or TVFs, bridge the gap between stored procedures and views. Stored procedures let you pass in parameters and express complex logic. But they aren't composable, so you can't query over a stored procedure. On the other hand, a view doesn't take parameters and can only contain a single select statement, but it is composable. So like views and stored procedures, TVFs return tabular data, but they let you create complex logic and pass in parameters, just like a stored procedure, and they're composable like a view. So they really are the best of both worlds. So the key difference between a table-valued function and a stored procedure is that the result of a TVF is composable, which means that the results of a TVF can be used in a linked query, whereas results of a stored procedure cannot. And right now, Entity Framework only supports TVFs for database-first models. But there are some kludgy workarounds if you want to force fit into things like code-first and model-first. So database-first only. First thing I want to do is use Management Studio to take a look at a table-valued function here within the AdventureWorks 2012 database. So here's table-valued functions, and as you can see, there's a single function. So I'll right-click on that and modify so we can take a look at the source code. So the interesting thing about this definition is that it returns a table object. So this becomes the value of the function, thus the name table-valued function, and it defines this table. So it has a person ID, first name, last name, job title, and business entity type. So this is just going to be a set of rows like any other stored procedure or view, but this return value is composable, so we can execute queries directly against this value. All right, and so then the rest of the function just does some complex logic in order to return certain types of people. Okay, so it's going to get contact information, and so it's joining with other tables in order to retrieve all of this information. Okay, so it doesn't really matter what the table-valued function is doing, but that's the one that I'm going to use within the sample application. All right, so let's go back over to the model here. So here I am in Visual Studio. This is the model that I created from the AdventureWorks 2012 database. And I'll go over to Model Browser. And notice that I have this function import section here. And this lists all of the functions and stored procedures that I imported as part of creating this model. I selected them all. So these are all of the stored procedures and functions that are available within the AdventureWorks database. Okay, now, in a real application, I would almost certainly rename this. UFN get contact information. I'd probably at least rename it to get contact information. I didn't do any kind of model cleanup like that because I wanted it to be very easy to relate the object name within the model to the underlying object within the database. But a real application, I would have renamed and cleaned all this up. Okay, so I can expand this node, and you can see that it takes a person ID parameter. All right, I can right-click on it and select Edit, and that opens up this Edit Function Import dialog box. So here's where you can rename it. Here's where you can set this option here. The function import is composable option just controls what's listed in the list of stored procedures and function names. So because I have that checked, it's only going to list objects that are composable. And so in this case, the only thing that I imported, the only thing that turns out is available within the AdventureWorks 2012 database is this user-defined function, table-valued function. Okay. Now another thing is the wizard did when I reverse engineered the database is it created a complex type, and the standard naming convention is the name of the function, in this case UFN get contact information, with an underscore result appended to it. Okay, now you can change this, and just like any other object within Entity Framework, you can change how this works and so forth, but this complex object just works perfectly well for me. And then there's the ability to get column information if you're, and this is really more useful if you are creating this complex type from scratch rather than it being created by the wizard. Okay, so this is the object that I'm going to be working with within my code. Now, the reason why I need a complex object here, or what Entity Framework calls complex objects, is that the fields that are being returned by this user-defined function do not correspond to an object, to an entity that I have defined within the model. If this returned all of the fields of the person object, I could use a person object instead. I could select entities and select person. But this is a subset of objects. So there's no object in my model without this complex object that returns the data from that function. So that's the reason why I need a complex object there. Okay, so I'm going to cancel out of that because I didn't make any changes to it. So now I can look at complex types, and as you can see, it created a complex type for the use with some of those functions. And here's the one that is the UFN get contact information underscore result. Widen that a little bit. So there's the complex type. I can right click on that, add, check properties. You can see the name, change the name, and so forth. And then I can expand this in order to get a list of the fields that are returned from the function and therefore are the fields of this class. Okay, keep in mind this is a class that I can use within my application. Okay, and then I can also go over here to Model Browser. I'm sorry, to Solution Explorer, because there's not really a way to get the view of the code, unfortunately. Right click on that again. There's no View Code option here. So I can go to Solution Explorer and drill down into my model one more time. Come down here and all of my objects and scroll down. And there's the UFN get contact information result, and there's the definition of that class. And nothing surprising there, but this is the class that the code that was generated for the class by the wizard. Okay, so that's all the infrastructure for Entity Framework that supports this. Let's put this object to use now. So I'm going to create another action method here within the home controller. And so I'll create a public. I'm going to once again return an action result, and I'm going to call this table valued function. And I need to provide it with a parameter. Remember that function requires a parameter, a person ID. So I'll name it that. Okay, and what I'm going to do now is use another link expression, and I'm going to get a person back. It's not going to be a person object. And I'll use the context object, and I'm going to use that method of that context object. Remember, that's the imported function. I'm going to pass in the person ID as the parameter, and then I'm going to convert that to a list. And it's going to be of that type. So all I'm doing with this code is I'm executing that table valued function in the database that is exposed through that method of the context object. And it's going to return that complex object. And I could, instead of using var, I could specify that complex object as well. But var is just a little bit easier. If I modify the link expression later, I don't need to worry about changing that type. Although when I use person, it might affect that. Okay, and then I'm going to return, call the view method, oops, and pass in that person object, which is in fact going to be that complex type. Okay, save my changes, and we're ready to create the view. Okay, right click on this and add view. I'll accept the default name, but this time I want a list because potentially that could return multiple values. Okay, it's going to be based on that UFN object, so this is where I reference that complex type. And I use the same context object and click on add. And we have a problem. I'm really sorry to say that this is apparently a bug with either Entity Framework 6.1.2 or Visual Studio Tooling. I really wasn't able to find much information about this problem. But what it's essentially saying is that none of my entities have keys defined. So sales territory has no key defined. Store has no key defined. Define the key for this entity type. Okay, and ultimately, really the error is that it was unable to retrieve the metadata for that object, which is also bogus. Okay, so in fact, if we take one, so employee is one of the ones. Entity employee has no key defined. Define the key. So let's go back over to the model, cancel out of that, and go to the employee table. Right there. And there you can see it does in fact have a key defined. If I look at the properties of that, you can see that the entity key is true. Okay, so these are all bogus messages. So I don't know why this is a problem with it, but the model works fine, the code is going to work fine, but I just can't create a view. So there's really the problem is someplace in that view dialog box. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears, and I'm going to come back over here and right click once again and add a view. And actually what I'm going to do is just bypass that entirely. I could use an empty view, but an alternative way of doing this is that I can come over here to Solution Explorer, clean that up, scroll around, and right click here and select Add View. So I get a similar dialog box, but it's a little bit cleaner and clearer because I'm not going to create a strongly typed view. The view is ultimately going to be strongly typed, but this is just a way to get a file with some of the format of the basic structure that I need. I'm still going to call this table value function. Make sure my name right there, table valued function. Okay, I'm going to create an empty one. It's not going to be based on any model class. These are disabled anyway because I didn't create it from my action method. I created it from the folder over here. And I'll accept the defaults as usual. All right, so that creates the file. So now what I need to do is fill out the code for this view manually. All right, so the first thing I need to do is specify the model. So it needs @model. And it's going to be a list because this is going to return a collection of items. And it's going to be of that UFN type. UFN get contact information underscore result. Then, okay. All right, so that's the model that I'm going to use, the object, and it's going to be a list, a generic list of those objects. And the reason because I didn't specify the namespace, that would help. There we go. And there, if I continue typing UFN, yeah, so I just forgot the complete namespace. Oops. Okay, so now the red squiggly should go away. Great. Okay, I'm going to leave that. Oh, well, I'll clean it up just a little bit. And I'll clean up this a little bit as long as I'm manually changing this code. Okay, so that's the header. Now, one of the things I'm going to do is that the default formatting for this isn't really all that attractive. So I'm just going to add one style here in order to just pretty up the table that's going to be displayed. And I'm just going to create a style on the table element or table cell. And I'm going to set the padding to 15 pixels. Okay. Just to make it a little bit easier to read when we get the final table. Okay, so now I need to define a table. Again, this is code that the view dialog box, add view dialog box, should have created for me. And I'll do usual HTML stuff, and I'll have a header here with a column name of ID, another table header of name, header of job title, And these, of course, are just the 4 fields that are returned by that table valued function and entity type. Okay, that's my header for the table. And now I'm going to have to loop through the list of objects that are returned as the model for the view. So I'm going to use the @ just delineates code from HTML within the Razor View engine for MVC. And so I'm going to say for each, and I'm going to do var item in model. So I'm just going to loop through all the items in that collection. And then I'm going to create a row for each of those. And I'll use an HTML helper method again, called display for, and I'll use the usual notation within the Razor View engine for accessing an item within the model. And I'm going to here display the person ID. And I forgot my TDs. Let me add those. And then continue on adding the other elements. That first one that I just entered is going to display the person ID. So now I want to display the first name. Use that same method. Use model item again. Nothing magic about the model item name. It's just a convenient for the expression there. And use item.firstName. And then I'll just put in a space and use the same technique. For the last name. Okay, 2 more pieces of data. This time for the job title. And last one for the business entity type. Okay, so that's my view. A little bit of a pain because of that bug in the Add View dialog box, but it's not really all that painful to create that. A little bit tedious, but that's about it. All right, I'll save my work, and the last thing I need to do is add a link to my index view. Put in a line break, and use the HTML action link. Text I want to display on the page is table valued function contact information. And in this case, the action method that I want to execute is table valued function. But in this case, I need to pass in a parameter. So I have to include an additional item here and new up an anonymous object and pass in person ID is equal to 1969. Happens to be a valid person value within the database. That little squiggly will go away. That should be okay. Oh, that's what the problem is. IntelliSense added new object. I just want a new anonymous object there. And the reason I got the squiggly is because person ID is not a property of the system.object within .NET. And so I didn't need that extra object tag that IntelliSense inserted for me. Okay, so I'll go ahead and run this, and if I've done everything right and didn't make any mistakes in creating that view, we should be able to see the list of items that are returned for that person ID value that I'm passing in. Click on that. And there we have it. Now, what's kind of interesting about this is that with the data that's in AdventureWorks 2012, this particular table valued function, the way it works, always returns a single row of data. So just be aware there's not going to be any cases that I've found where you're going to get more than one row returned from this. We still have to treat it as a list because it's returning a list of rows. If I really only wanted to display one thing and set everything up to do that, within my query in the action method, I would have to use the first or default method on the link expression to return just a single row. Okay, so just a little bit of a weirdness there. All right, so that's how you can use a table valued function. It really doesn't require any additional configuration. As long as you import the function correctly when you create the model and then use it and don't make any changes to it that will break this functionality. But you can fiddle with the complex type. You can use your own code for the complex type. You do have a lot of options when you're working with these functions within Entity Framework.